As I mentioned in the Sabbath school time, as I was preparing the Sabbath school lesson, I planned to speak on something else, but I got really interested in the lessons that we have for today from the story of Noah. And there's no way I could cover the whole story, so I just picked out a few questions, and we're going to look at the answer to those questions. So I've entitled it As It Was in Noah's Time, because it's a forecast of the last days. So this one I used to advance. No? Yeah, it's not advancing the usual way. Usually I just hit this.
Get the expert to fix it.
Here?
Yeah.
Okay. So, as it was in Noah's time. Why? Because it's a forecast of the last days. In fact, I've discovered that the stories that are told in the Old Testament are a prophetic story of the last days. And often, that's not picked up on. And so we don't get all the information that we could have. But this one is easy because the Bible identifies it. And we'll read again Matthew 24, 37 to 40. It says, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Now we know from other studies that the actual appearance of Christ in the clouds of heaven will not be the fulfillment of this. But it is the close of probation that is the fulfillment of this passage. And if you think about Noah's time, when that door closed, that was the end of the probation for that Noahic world. And so it was 7 days before it rained. And they were happy. They were not in the ark for 7 days. And so this is the parallel that's being set up here. From the close of probation till Jesus comes in the clouds is all lumped together as the coming of the Son of Man. Because for everybody, at the close of probation, it's just like Jesus came. Nobody changes sides. After that, it's settled what direction they're going to go. So the first question, what was the earth like at the time of the flood? And we can expect that the earth is going to be similar, at least some of the earth maybe is going to be similar to what it was like. Well, the first thing that we find out is that it was still very beautiful. Now, there are parts of the world that are not very beautiful today, but if we look at what the wealthy are able to do in regard to their houses and their grounds and so on, we get a picture of something very similar to what was in those days. And in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 90, says the vast garden-like plains were clothed with verdure and sweet with the fragrance of 1,000 flowers. The fruits of the earth were in great variety and almost without limit. This, to me, seems to be describing the menu in the United States for an awful lot of people. Not the real poor, no, but we are eating the fruits from all over the world. You know, when I was a boy, we never had mangoes, but now you can get them in plenty, pineapples and whatever you want to eat. The trees far surpassed in size, beauty, and perfect proportion any now to be found. Their wood was of fine grain and hard substance, closely resembling stone, and hardly less enduring. And in another page, it says, which would be untouched by decay for hundreds of years. So that ark remained to be seen by people for hundreds of years because the wood was so strong, so firm in its grain that it was like stone and it could hardly decay. Then we have gold, silver, and precious stones existed in abundance. Now we don't have, things quite like that, but the interesting thing is that man has still been interested in piling up all of the things that God has made available as much as they can, and those with plenty of money have done it in their area. And so what happened to the Noahic world was partly the result of the luxury that they were living in. And when people live in this kind of luxury, they have a tendency to drift into sin and to not listen to what God is telling them. And this is happening again in our world today, and especially in countries like the US. But if you take a look at China, some of their cities and so on, very, very similar what is happening in our world today. In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 90, says the human race yet retained much of its early vigor. You know that for 2,000 years, approximately, people could break every health law in the book and they wouldn't get sick. And so here at the time of the flood, they had retained a lot of the health and energy that existed in the very beginning. And there were many giants, men of great stature and strength, renowned for wisdom, skillful in devising the most cunning and wonderful works. Now, we don't have too many giants today. At least they're not big like they were back then. But because of the invention of printing and so on, the wisdom that has been gained by many people is incredible. It still hasn't surpassed that group of people back then, but it is amazing what man is able to do. And I just read one, how they're making embryos half human and half monkey. Well, this is, the amalgamation that was one of the causes of the flood. And to be able to do that takes quite a bit of skill and understanding to be able to do things like that. Well, as I said, every detail of this part of the message is not true today, but enough of it is that we can see that things are progressing even from that side to be time for the end time things to happen. And also, page 90 says, God bestowed upon these antediluvians many and rich gifts, but they used his bounties to glorify themselves. Now that's the real issue. It's not how many of the things that God has made that we have, but of the ones we do have, what are we doing with it? And sad to say, today, those that have, the more they have, they want to lavish upon themselves. And then it says, and turn them into a curse by fixing their affections upon the gifts instead of the giver. You know, even a person that's quite poor can do that. I experienced how eager poor people are to get a little better off, and what they'll do to try to get better off and to have some things, and they don't mind crowding somebody else out. You know, when I lived in Washington, D.C., they would always have a big sale on Washington's birthday. And people would go to the store and they would camp overnight so that they could get in, because the supply of TVs or whatever it was that they were selling at a ridiculously low price was limited. And so, you know, they would charge into the store. It didn't matter who they were crowding out so that they could get whatever it was. And so, although God's original intention was for the good things of this earth to be a blessing to the human race, the selfishness that was created in us by sin has made it more likely, without God's help especially, that we will hoard money, possessions, whatever it is, to benefit ourselves instead of doing with it what we were supposed to do. And that's what contributed to the world becoming so wicked that God had to bring a flood. And so that's what's happening today. And companies are getting bigger than ever before and amassing huge amounts of wealth. Now, this is the one we usually think of when we think of the flood, but I thought that other one was an interesting one because it played a big part in preparing people to be in a condition where the flood had to come. But what were the sins that brought the flood? Patriarchs and Prophets 95 and 6. The men of that generation were not all, in the fullest acceptation of the term, idolaters. It was kind of hard to become an idolater in the full sense of the term, with the Garden of Eden there and the angels, and you know, almost everybody knew where it was, I'm sure. Many professed to be worshipers of God. They claimed that their idols were representations of the deity, and that through them the people could obtain a clearer conception of the divine being. People are doing that today. Millions of people all over the world are making images, and they say the same thing. Well, we're not worshiping the image. We simply want this to remind us of God or some saint or whatever that they have made the image of. Now, haven't heard anybody say it gives them a clearer understanding, but they feel it gives them an understanding. And yet, it was made by human hands. How can anything made by human hands give any kind of help toward what God is like or to what heavenly things are like? This class were foremost in rejecting the preaching of Noah. Isn't that interesting? Here they were claiming to be worshipers of God, and yet they were the first ones, the most foremost, to condemn Noah and what he was teaching. So we can expect that the people that do that today are going to be foremost in condemning the true message, which I believe has been given to Seventh-day Adventists. The message that we bear is to the world today has the exact same relationship as the message that was given to Noah had for his day. And that's why we can't afford to just sit on it and not do something about giving it. Noah didn't sit on it. Now, Noah had one advantage. He could preach in one place and everybody came to him. Today, we can't do that. Satan has too many things going, and so we can't do that. We have to go everywhere and do it. But God will enable us to give a powerful message, just like he did Noah. They employed the gold and silver, the precious stones. Oops, I must have hit something. They employed the gold and silver, the precious stones, and the choice wood in the construction of habitations for themselves, and endeavored to excel one another in beautifying their dwellings with the most skillful workmanship. They sought only to gratify the desires of their own proud hearts and reveled in the scenes of pleasure and wickedness. So instead of thinking about the needs of others who were starving to death and who were having all kinds of other problems to contend with, they were thinking about themselves and how much they could beautify their own property and their homes. And then, of course, to have as much spare time as possible for pleasure and for doing all kinds of things. There is an awful lot of that same kind of activity taking place today. And it's not all outside the Christian world where that is taking place. It is found its way into the Christian church and into even the Adventist church, because people are not getting the points of the lesson from Noah to today. And this is not the time to have more than what we need, or to make things more lavish than what is appropriate for this hour of Earth's history. That this is the time to get everything we can into the ark. You see, Noah, by the time the flood came, he didn't own anything. Everything was in that ark. And and in whatever it took to live while he was preaching all that and building the ark. So that is the model for us today, that we are to be watching for ways that we can get everything we can into an ark, which in this case is to get people that are prepared to go to heaven, so that if there was an ark, they would get on board that ark. Here from page 91, not desiring to retain God in their knowledge, they soon came to deny his existence. So there were different groups of people, And some people went so far as to deny that God even exists. That is certainly growing in our world today. And so it's very similar. They adored nature in place of the God of nature. So they liked what God made, but they didn't believe in him. They glorified human genius. Have you noticed that that's what happens today? In the Olympics, we glorify the one that can do those amazing feats, and we set them up on a pedestal and we honor them. We give the Nobel Prize to people that have made some tremendous contribution. There is so much honoring of human nature, not honoring the giver. Everything that people have was given by God. But God is not getting the credit today for the things that people are doing. They glorified human genius, worshiped the works of their own hands, and taught their children to bow down to graven images. And so many people worship the great buildings that people can figure out how to build. And I think the Twin Towers was one of those, but God allowed those to fall to demonstrate not to do this, but the lesson didn't seem to take on. And so one day there's going to be a lot of those buildings that get destroyed to show that they were thinking in the wrong direction. We have to be careful as well, because we might start to think that the strength of our work is in the wonderful buildings and grounds that we have in our institutions, but this is not what we are to glory in. We are to glory in the fact that God is able to work through us and to make sure that we give the credit to him for whatever was accomplished. That's where the focus should be, but it's going to be in the days just before the close of probation, the same glorifying of human beings and what human beings can do as there was back then. And also on page 91, says the wickedness of men was open and daring. So they didn't try to hide it. They were very bold about it and wanted people to know. Here's another one. Justice was trampled in the dust. Today, only by God's mercy could you get justice in the court system. There is so much injustice in the court system for a variety of reasons that that is becoming like the flood and the time of the flood, this lack of justice. And as a result, and the cries of the oppressed reached unto heaven. The people that are not treated properly, that don't get the advantages that God wanted them to have. And so if they have any sense of God at all, they're pleading with him to deliver them from this condition. And so there comes a point that God says, okay, we're not going to let them suffer anymore. They've had enough, and we're going to deliver them. Well, that was the way it was leading up to the flood. It's becoming more like this now. Pages 91 and 2. Polygamy had been early introduced. Now you might say, well, we don't have very many places where polygamy is allowed or practiced. Have you ever thought about consecutive polygamy? In other words, you don't have a house with two wives, but the person divorces without Bible grounds, which means in the books of heaven they're still married, and they go and marry somebody else. That's polygamy. It's just doing it one at a time. And this is very rampant in our world today. In fact, the legal system will permit it. You know, you can do that. There's nobody that says it's bad. And sad to say, churches are beginning to say it's okay as well. The way they do it is they say, well, if you tried hard to save your first marriage and you can't save it, okay, you can get married again. Not saying, well, does the Bible give you permission to do that? So this polygamy has come back in a more sneaky form. You know, Satan is getting more sly as time goes on. Men chose to follow their own sinful desires, and as the result, crime and wretchedness rapidly increased. Neither the marriage relation nor the rights of property were respected. So people didn't mind just encroaching on your land or maybe even taking it away from you. Or if they liked your wife better than theirs, they would kill you and take your wife. Just no respect for the proper ownership that God has. And I've had a little taste of that. We have a little piece of property that we got, thinking sometime I might need to leave Wildwood when the next president comes along. I'm thankful he's allowing us to stay, but sometimes, you know, the president doesn't want the next one around. So we had this property. Well, I went to visit it the other day because I hadn't been there in quite a while. And the neighbor has put some old junk on our property. He didn't ask. He just figured, hey, I need some space to put this junk, and he put it on the property. So this attitude was before the flood. And we had another place that we had a tornado that destroyed it. But the neighbor, he was a nice neighbor really, but he used the corner of the property. And one day, I guess he felt he should at least ask if that was okay. So I was thankful that he asked. But he had been using it for who knows how long, you know, and without asking. Whoever coveted the wives or the possessions of his neighbor took them by force, and men exulted in their deeds of violence. We see that going on in these mobs that are, you know, attacking various things in the city. They don't care what the laws are or whether they have a right to something. They delighted in destroying the life of animals, and the use of flesh for food rendered them still more cruel and bloodthirsty until they came to regard human life with astonishing indifference. Have you noticed that human life is becoming less valuable than animal life in some respects? And of course, we have those that are cruel to animals as well. We have both groups today, and those that are fighting for animal rights and so on. They want to make sure those people stop that, but I don't think it'll ever stop, because it's in human nature to be cruel to animals, and to eat meat leads to being cruel to not only animals but to human beings. And this is the way it developed there before the flood. What works, Satan tries again, you see. Now here's one in the spiritual realm, page 101. The sins that called for vengeance upon the antediluvian world exist today. The fear of God is banished from the hearts of men, and his law is treated with indifference and contempt. The intense worldliness of that generation is equaled by that of the generation now living. I was thinking about that part of the sentence. That was written over 100 years ago. If the intense worldliness of that generation was equal to the flood, we are really living on borrowed time. And as we look at the conditions in which we are surrounded with today, certainly we can see that this is absolutely true, that we are at the time that is like the time just before the flood came. Not at the beginning of the 120 years, but we're at near the close of the 120 years. And on page 96, it says they finally declared that the divine law was no longer in force. Isn't it amazing that there are ministers who are claiming the same thing, that the law of God is no longer in force, especially the fourth commandment, but in the process, they talk about the whole law. That it was contrary to the character of God to punish transgression. Have you noticed that at funerals, they never put anybody in hell? They always put them in heaven. And the message that's being given is that no matter how you live, you end up in heaven. Even though I'm sure the pastors know better about some of those funerals, that they're not going to be in heaven. And so the idea is that, well, God doesn't really punish transgression. And then you've probably heard that there is a doctrine which is very widely taught that there's going to be 1,000 years when the people that didn't get ready when the rapture occurred, that those people are going to be able to get ready during the 1,000 years. So ultimately, everybody's going to make it. Well, those kind of things in maybe a different form were being taught before the flood came, and it prepared the way for things to get in such a horrible condition that the flood actually had to come. This one, the more I studied for this sermon, I became convicted. I think in the past we have focused mostly on the sins. And it's true, those sins were there. And they're there today. But that was not the biggest reason why the world got destroyed with a flood. This one is, page 96. It says their minds had become so blinded by rejection of light that they really believed Noah's message to be a delusion. But in order to believe it was a delusion, they had to reject a lot of light. And this, of course, is the work that we have, to present the light. If we don't present it, and they are terrible sinners, it's not all their fault, because sin is very natural for the human being to do. And the less they're connected with God, the more sin they're going to do. And we condemn them for being terrible sinners because they're doing such horrible things. And, that doesn't help the situation at all. Instead, we have to be sharing the light. And the light will not be welcomed by most of them, but it will be at least giving them the opportunity to avoid what's coming. Also, page 96, it says, the world made merry at the folly of the deluded old man. So by this time, Noah was fairly old. He did live quite a while after the flood, but he was quite old. And so as they listened and the word spread around, he became the object of their jokes and making merry because they were rejecting the light. And page 97 says, by their obstinate resistance, and notice this part, to the reproofs of conscience. So the message of Noah was so powerful that their conscience told them he's right. But they rejected that evidence. By their obstinate resistance to the reproofs of conscience and the warnings of God's prophet, that generation filled up the measure of their iniquity and became ripe for destruction. Notice it wasn't the sins that they did. The sins were simply snowballing because they kept rejecting light. And so they became more wicked. But the cause of becoming wicked was the rejection of light. Now, there's a very important lesson in this. We as Seventh-day Adventists have been given an abundance of light. If we reject that light, it's going to make us among the worst people on earth. Because the more light that gets rejected, the worse we become. And then one way of not responding to light is not reading and not studying and not trying to find out what God has asked us to do. And so that has its danger also. But we must be careful not to reject the light. When you read something, you might have to say, well, I need to study this a little more, but don't reject it simply because you think it doesn't make sense or it's not something we have to do today. That is a dangerous path to be on, and many are following that path today. That was the big reason why they became so wicked. God always gives enough evidence, and he gave a finale that was just incredible. Page 97, they continued their festivities and their gluttonous feasts. They ate and drank, planted and builded, laying their plans in reference to advantages they hoped to gain in the future. And they went to greater lengths in wickedness and in defiant disregard of God's requirements to testify that they had no fear of the Infinite One. So they wanted to make sure that everybody knew we're not worried about the threat of a flood at all. God isn't going to do that. But that was after they watched, excuse me, those animals going 2 by 2 into the ark. And I didn't put this one in here, but for a little bit, when they saw those animals going in and the birds flying in there with nobody directing them, they had to stop for a while. And they didn't make fun for a little while. But then the quote that I just read began to take place. They rejected the final light that was given to them. That was the last opportunity they had to decide. Well, I was thinking, what could be that final light that God is going to give? And I believe it is the latter rain. It is going to go, we're told, with 10 times the power of the Millerite movement. And when they reject that, then the close of probation is there. It's going to happen because the next thing that God did was to shut the door of the ark. And once that door was starting to go up, it was the end for that generation. The last question is, what did God do to warn the world? We've already talked about some of it, but in Genesis 6:3, it says, "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." And usually when we read that text, we're thinking about that the end of the 120 years will be the flood. However, I thought of another emphasis that we should really think about. And that is that there was going to be, for 120 years, a mighty outpouring of the Holy Spirit to try to help those people understand the light that God was trying to give to them. And only after they would reject the ministry of the Holy Spirit, then they would be destroyed. So here is an interesting statement on page 96. "A power attended his words, for it was the voice of God to man through his servant." So this is a forecast of the early and latter rain that's coming just before the close of probation. And God, it wasn't just Noah giving a lecture, but when he spoke, the Holy Spirit was poured through him, and it was so powerful that the people's conscience was affected and they knew that he was right. But then they either went away and stopped thinking about it until it was gone, or they consciously turned against it. But it wasn't possible to be in ignorance of what was being said by God. And then on 97, it has this phrase, "Men whose hearts had at times trembled with fear." So as the Holy Spirit was reaching them, they trembled with fear. That, yeah, this is right, I need to do something. But they didn't follow that. And you know, I'm afraid that a lot of people have done the same. That maybe in a church service or Sabbath school class or some other opportunity, the Holy Spirit has brought strong conviction to them that you need to make a change in your life, and then they go away and they don't make it. We're setting ourselves up to do exactly the same thing that happened in that day. But it's too late to be doing that. We must, when the Holy Spirit is speaking to us, we must listen and follow what is said. Then we come, the animals are in the ark, and Noah makes his final appeal. Page 97 and 8. "With an agony of desire that words cannot express, he entreated them to seek a refuge while it might be found. Again, they rejected his words and raised their voices in jest and scoffing. Suddenly, a silence, this is just before the beast came in. Suddenly, a silence fell upon the mocking throng." Think of it. Here he is giving his last appeal, not realizing what God was going to do. But God did something that would drive this home so that they had to stop their mocking. Beasts of every description, the fiercest as well as the most gentle, were seen coming from mountain and forest and quietly making their way toward the ark. Noise as of a rushing wind was heard, and lo, birds were flocking from all directions, their numbers darkening the heavens, and in perfect order they passed into the ark. The world looked on in wonder, some in fear. Now their hearts were about as hard as people's hearts could get, but God gave so much power. He had a way of being able to convince them that what Noah's been telling you all this time is right. And yet, they would not back up. When Jesus comes in the clouds of glory, they will not be able to say, I didn't know. And that's the way it's going to be. We need to expect the power of God to attend our message. We don't need to feel that we're going to be weak in giving the message to the world. That is, if we're giving it straight, the way it ought to be. If we will give the message, God is going to give the same power to us that he gave to Noah to preach that message. And we don't need to worry about the results. We can't have a much worse result than what he had. We're not to worry about that, but we are to give the message and to know that the people that we're speaking to are going to get the point, whether they accept it or not. They're going to get the point. And it wouldn't be fair for them to be lost if they didn't know in their mind that what's being said is correct and that they should listen to it. And then if they don't listen to it, then of course that's on them. That was the end. It says in page 98, mercy had ceased its pleadings. That was the last. A flash of dazzling light was seen, and a cloud of glory more vivid than the lightning descended from heaven and hovered before the entrance of the ark. So they saw that. The massive door, which it was impossible for those within to close, was slowly swung to its place by unseen hands. You know, it's another evidence of Noah's trust in God. He didn't say, there's no point in making a door this big, we'll never get it closed. How would we close it? But he built it exactly as God said, like he did everything else. And God had planned to close that door himself. And as he did, for the angel to be seen by everybody, but it was already too late. They would not be able to go in to that ark. Oops. Page 99, notwithstanding the solemn scenes which they had witnessed, the beasts and birds entering the ark, and the angel of God closing the door, so they saw both of those absolute miracles, they still continued their sport and revelry, even making a jest of those signal manifestations of God's power. Can you see that God is not bad to kill them? I mean, they were hopeless. There was no more light that could be given to them. They would destroy themselves if God left them. And so, you know, God is totally right to destroy them, and he will be in the end of time. They gathered in crowds about the ark, deriding its inmates with a daring violence which they had never ventured upon before. So now, just like in the last days, when probation closes, there will be a hatred for God's people that will surpass anything that's ever been seen before. And they will be so thankful they didn't listen to the message and will try to wipe out every one of God's people. But God says, no, you're not going to wipe out even one after the close of probation. In Patriarchs and Prophets 96, here was their philosophy. They said, the threatenings of God are for the purpose of intimidating and will never be verified. You need not be alarmed. That was their philosophy. However, in page 97, it says, had the Diluvians believed the warning and repented of their evil deeds, the Lord would have turned aside his wrath as he afterward did from Nineveh. The flood was totally unnecessary. The flood did not have to happen, but it happened because they would not accept the light, and they would not change, and for their own good, God destroyed them. Because they were a curse to themselves when they had rejected so much light. So, those are a few of the parallels that we can see with the last days. And as we look about us, it's not hard to figure that things are very, very similar. And when even your own brothers and sisters, if you see them rejecting light, don't follow what they're doing. And look for all the light that you can, because that's the bottom line. What is this generation going to do with the light that God has been shining upon our pathway? And for every bit of light that we reject, we become worse. And all of us are capable of becoming just like those people. So the rejection of light is a very dangerous thing. And God is shedding the light, and he's going to be shedding the light more and more. He's stirring up his instruments to give the light and to make plain what Seventh-day Adventists ought to do, how they ought to live, what they should be doing as far as taking the message to their neighbors and to others. And he's going to call people to be missionaries and go, to difficult places. But whatever light he shines upon our path, it's time that we respond and no longer either don't pay any attention or reject that light. May God help each of us as we are going to be that final generation that is going to see a similar result to what Noah saw in his day. May we be as faithful as Noah was at that time.